Hi there. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. This is where we dive deep into the trials and triumphs of conservation in Africa. And on this journey, we'll be dissecting Africa's conservation challenges and uncovering some really cool homegrown solutions. I'm your host, Elizabeth Gitari Mitaro. So on this episode, we're going to talk about CIA. No, not the Central Intelligence Agency, but climate impact assessments. And this is a follow-up episode from our episode 3, where we discussed the Nairobi-Mombasa Expressway. And we're going to see how climate impact assessments would have a role to play in that particular project. Now, as we focus on climate impact assessments, which are a critical aspect of project development and their importance in ensuring sustainable development, we're also going to discuss the significant partnership with the Global Center on Adaptation, that is the GCA, and how that actually enhances a project's resilience and sustainability. So the first question is, what is a climate impact assessment? Now, we've all heard about environmental impact assessments, and we have an upcoming episode on EIAs and why they are important and how to conduct them, and why so many cases, either at the National Environment Tribunal as well as the Environment and Land Court, are actually based on improperly conducted environmental impact assessments. But what is not actually discussed, and what a lot of projects don't pay enough attention to, are climate impact assessments. Now, a climate impact assessment evaluates the potential impacts of infrastructural projects or any other type of projects on climate and vice versa. What this means is that it integrates the climate change considerations into planning and the decision-making the decision-making process on exactly how the project is going to be implemented, with the specific aim of enhancing resilience and sustainability as a result of that particular project. And so we can see how this would be a critical aspect in the Nairobi-Mombasa Expressway project that is meant to be starting actually quite soon. So then the second question is, what is the regulatory framework around climate impact assessments? Why don't we hear a lot about them? Why do project proponents often only focus on environmental impact assessments? Now, in Kenya specifically, climate impact assessments are actually integrated into the environmental impact assessment framework under what we introduced last time, the act called the Environmental Management and Coordination Act. The short form of that is EMCA. So the legal framework for that actually starts with Kenya's Vision 2030, which we all know is a development blueprint that is still being implemented, even if it started with the presidential term of former President Mwai Kibaki, rest in peace. And Vision 2030 outlines the long-term development footprint that actually emphasizes on sustainability. We also have the National Environment Policy that aligns development projects, and especially national level development projects, with sustainable development goals that Kenya has already committed to and aligned to at the international framework. Then we also have under EMCA specific sections that actually deal with EIA framework that we have said also includes the climate impact assessments. And these specific sections are, if we start all the way from section 58, that essentially mandates that environmental impact assessments for projects that are likely to have a significant environmental impact should also include an analysis and an assessment of what the climate impacts might be. Then we go on to section 59, which then requires public participation around environmental impact assessments. And we've had an episode on public participation. Then also section 60, I'm sure, that outlines the approval process for EIAs that actually integrate climate considerations. Now, it is not always that project proponents, and especially experts who have conducted environmental impact assessments have actually included climate impact assessments. And the insistence on having climate impact assessments as part of the EIA process was actually buttressed by a specific case that was brought before the National Environment Tribunal that involved the Nairobi Expressway that runs from the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport all the way down to Waiyaki Way Westlands. And during that litigation, there were certain specific issues that were raised by the court. So let's actually review what the court said and what specifically the tribunal says in that particular case. The actual case is the Greenbelt Movement versus four others and the National Environment Management Authority and another, the Kenya National Highways Authorities as an interested party. And this was a case that was brought by the Greenbelt Movement before the National Environment Tribunal in the year 2020. It's actually appeal number 19 of 2020. It's an environmental appeal that was brought by the Greenbelt Movement against NEMA for issuing a license, an environmental impact assessment license, to the development and to the Kenya National Highways Authority to have this particular road. So, what are the facts of the case? Now, the specific case against the China Road and Bridge Corporation and NEMA that was brought by the Greenbelt Movement contested the issuance of an EIA license by NEMA to the contractor, meaning China Road and Bridge Company or Corporation, for the construction of the Nairobi Expressway. The main contention and the request or the prayers by the appellants was that they wanted NEMA to cancel the EIA license, specifically arguing that there were specific procedures that were not adhered to in the conduct of the EIA, and that one of those procedures was the conducting of a strategic environmental assessment, or a SEA, that the process did not have adequate public participation. Over and above that, the appellants also called for the development of a resettlement action plan and the completion of a new EIA that follows a strategic environmental assessment that incorporated the impact on the climate, or a climate impact assessment, as part of the EIA report. And so the tribunal had to decide on a number of issues. Number one, whether NEMA had approved the terms of reference for the EIA without actually conducting a proper scoping exercise as required by the EIA regulations, whether a SEA, meaning a strategic environmental assessment, was actually necessary before issuing an EIA license. There was also the question of whether there was proper and adequate public participation in the process. And lastly, and most importantly for the purposes of this discussion, whether the failure to conduct a climate impact assessment prior to issuing of the EIA license was a significant oversight that made it necessary to overturn or revoke the EIA license that was issued. So, the tribunal reviewed the law and looked at MCA, specifically Section 129, that outlines the power of the tribunal to confirm or set aside and vary decisions that are made by NEMA. Number two, they looked at the environmental impact assessment and audit regulations of 2003. And these regulations required, number one, a scoping exercise as part of an EIA process. Number two, the regulations set out the requirements for public participation during the EIA process. And number three, the regulation refer for the need of a strategic environmental impact assessment in projects that have significant effects on the environment, and climate impact assessments are part of that strategic environmental assessment. There's obviously also a link to the Climate Change Act of 2016 that essentially defines climate change as a change in the climate system caused by significant changes in the concentration of greenhouse gases due to human activities, and then mandates the Climate Change Act mandates NEMA to integrate climate risk and vulnerability assessments into all forms of environmental assessments. Now, all forms of environmental assessments include EIAs, strategic impact assessments, so on and so forth. And so when the tribunal was reviewing this and examining whether NEMA and the contractor had actually adhered to the MCA and the EIA regulations, the appellants, meaning the Greenbelt movement, actually made a significant argument that it is improper for NEMA to approve terms of reference without actually conducting the necessary scoping exercise. Number two, that the EIA license was actually issued without first requiring a strategic environmental assessment, and that the environmental assessment was insufficient because of Section 20 of the Climate Change Act that required that NEMA mandate that all environmental assessments must integrate climate risk and vulnerability assessments. And so the tribunal did find that, by and large, the project proponent, meaning the meaning Kenha, and the contractor, meaning China Bridge and Road Company Corporation, had largely complied with MCA and with EIA regulations. But there was a significant oversight in actually not conducting a climate impact assessment as part of the environmental impact assessment that was conducted. The tribunal actually emphasized that the project's potential to increase greenhouse gas emissions due to, obviously, the increased motor vehicle traffic, because then you'd have more people using the expressway, made it necessary for a CIA to be conducted. And it also noted that the failure to actually include a climate impact assessment was incredibly concerning, given the significant environmental impacts that were associated with the project. And so the outcome of all of this was that the tribunal concluded that the absence of a climate impact assessment was a critical gap in the environmental review process. However, instead of cancelling the EIA license, the tribunal actually ordered the contractor to conduct and complete a climate impact assessment within 18 months. And so, in as much as the EIA license for the expressway then was not cancelled, this was a significant step in ensuring that all EIA assessments or reports must include a climate impact assessment. And because of this particular ruling, that essentially buttressed what the position in the law was before, we now see that more and more proponents are actually taking keen interest in actually conducting the climate impact assessments. And so the question then becomes, how do you actually conduct a climate impact assessment as part of the EIA process? So let's delve into that and look at it. How do you actually conduct a climate impact assessment? The process essentially can be reduced into 5 steps, or essentially 4, but the 5th one is a cyclic process. So the first one, you conduct a baseline climate data collection. What does this mean? You gather current data on the current climate conditions and the trends as at the point of starting the project. Then after that, you do impact prediction, which is assessing how the project may affect local climate conditions and how climate change may actually impact the process. So you look at it from 2 lenses. Number 1, how is the project going to exacerbate climate conditions or change them or have an impact in climatic conditions? And then number 2, how are climate conditions and climate change going to impact the project? Then after you've done that, you then move on to vulnerability assessment. And what is involved here? Identifying areas and communities most vulnerable to climate impacts as a specific consequence of that particular project. So how are communities and societies that essentially live proximate or work proximate to the project going to be impacted by the climate impacts that flow out of that particular project? Then the fourth one is mitigation and adaptation strategies. You then need to go into designing and developing actual strategies to mitigate the adverse effects of the project that you have already identified, and essentially enhance the climate resilience of that particular project. For example, one of the issues or impacts, climate impacts, might be flooding for the Nairobi Expressway. And we actually found that during the last El Nino season, where there was a lot of flooding, cars were floating onto the expressway and so on and so forth. So if a proper climate impact assessment had been conducted for the expressway, we would have been able to find out how do we design this particular project to mitigate the adverse effects of flash floods in Nairobi. How are flash floods going to impact people who are using the expressway at that particular season? And how do we then minimize them or mitigate them? And how do we enhance climate resilience of that particular project? And then the last step, which I said at the beginning is a cyclical process, is the public participation, which is engaging stakeholders to ensure their concerns and insights are actually considered and looking into that entire scope. Since the last episode where we had a conversation around public participation, the episode where we talked about public participation, there is now flowing from the court's jurisprudence that mandates that policymakers, project proponents, and so on and so forth, anyone who gathers and collects views in a public participation process in Kenya has an obligation to actually give feedback to the public and to stakeholders on how their comments have actually been incorporated into the project or into the policy or into the law. And so that's an additional one. That's why we're saying it's a cyclical one. It does not just end during the climate impact assessment or the environmental impact assessment, but it's actually continuous because the law also demands that there must be environmental audits every 2 years of the life cycle of a project to ensure that the impacts that were identified and the mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies that were proposed and implemented are actually working and what their impacts are. So then the next question around the Nairobi-Mombasa Expressway. So now we've moved from the Nairobi Expressway, which moves from JKIA to Westlands, Waiyaki Way, and how that particular expressway and the litigation flowing from that emphasized the need for climate impact assessments. We've looked at what the law says around climate impact assessments, and we've looked at how to conduct them. The next question is, for the for the Mombasa, actually it's the Mombasa-Nairobi Expressway, depending on where you start. We are assuming that you're starting from Mombasa. But for the Mombasa Expressway, that's coming all the way, that's essentially meant to come all the way to Nairobi. Is there a climate impact assessment that has been conducted for this particular project as part of the broader environmental and social impact assessment process? And this is actually necessary, like we've said at the beginning of the episode, to actually comply with the approval granted by the PPP committee in December 2023. The PPP committee is the Public-Private Partnership Committee in December 2023 that actually gave the go-ahead to get into a public-private partnership for the building of the Mombasa-Nairobi Expressway. The answer to this question is that we have not actually found any proof of a climate impact assessment being done on the Nairobi-Mombasa Expressway or the Mombasa-Nairobi Expressway. And the implications of a climate impact assessment, like we've said, are threefold. Number one, enhancing resilience and ensuring, for example, that this expressway can withstand future climatic conditions and extreme weather events. Like the issue that we found with the Nairobi Expressway, the one that runs from JKIA, when we had El Nino and the floods happening, that this is not replicated in the Mombasa-Nairobi Expressway. Number two, that there is environmental protection and minimizing the adverse effects on local ecosystems and biodiversity. In the last episode, we saw that the Mombasa-Nairobi Expressway is actually going to impact huge parts of the Kasigao ecosystem, and how that particular ecosystem has huge implications around environmental protection and wildlife protection. And then lastly, the issue of community well-being, that climate impact assessments, specifically for this particular expressway, need to protect communities from climate-related risks and ensuring sustainable development benefits. And all of these issues essentially lead to the attainment and the alignment of these particular projects with long-term sustainability goals. It ensures that we are identifying and mitigating potential climate risks and the likelihood of project failure. And it also ensures that projects actually meet not only national and international regulations, but actually international best practice and standards for climate resilience and climate impact assessments. So let's go on to the Global Center for Adaptation Partnership. Let's move on to the Global Center on Adaptation Partnership. A pivotal aspect of the Mombasa-Nairobi Expressway project is the partnership with the Global Center on Adaptation. And this particular collaboration aims to essentially integrate advanced climate resilience measures into the expressway's design and construction. So the idea is that the GCA provides the technical expertise and support to ensure the project adopts the best climate adaptation practices. Number two, that the partnership introduces innovative solutions to enhance the expressway's resilience against climate change. And lastly, that the project actually aligns with global standards for climate resilience. Aligning the project with global standards for climate resilience, making it a model for other infrastructure projects in Africa and beyond. So then what can we do as citizens to ensure that the Nairobi-Mombasa Expressway actually meets the standards that were outlined in the Green Belt Movement case in 2019, meets the standards outlined in the Climate Change Act of 2016, and meets the standards outlined in the EMCA, the Environmental Management and Coordination Act, as well as the Environmental Impact Assessment and Audit Regulations of 2003. And that question can best be answered by going back to the conversation that we had around public participation, that we cannot afford to sit back and just wait to see what the climate impact assessment is going to be and to see the report at the end of it. We have to actually engage in the process. And so one of the things that we're doing together with our partners, the East African Wildlife Society, as well as our partners down that work within the Kasigao area, is we're putting together an advocacy plan, number one, of technical experts, and number two, of concerned private citizens who might be in a position to amplify this conversation and to ensure that we hold government accountable for conducting a proper environmental and social impact assessment that also includes a climate impact assessment for this particular project. If you'd want to engage in that process, please send us a note on all of our social media handles, email us, contact us, subscribe to our newsletter, and let's be part of the conversation. And that's all the time we have for today on Conservation Conversations. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really do hope that you've learned something new and that you actually feel empowered to take action towards a more sustainable future for all of us. Remember, even small changes make a huge difference. This conversation doesn't stop here. Please do connect with us on our social media channels at greenbrief_KE and at Liz Gitari across all platforms. We'll put all the links in the description box below. Until next time, keep well and keep changing the world.